Hello, and welcome to week 54 of our 2-year Bible study. We continue today in our study in Second Chronicles chapter 10, which is really a parallel to First Kings 12, which we took a look at last week. In Second Chronicles chapter 11, we see Rehoboam still in power. And in verse 14, it says, the Levites even abandoned their pasture lands and property and came to Judah and Jerusalem because Jeroboam and his sons have rejected them as priests of the Lord. So where Rehoboam is fortifying Judah and trying to build up the nation, and still is respecting Jehovah and the temple in Jerusalem. Jeroboam in the north has essentially cut off the Levites from being part of the worship in the north, which is a good thing because it was a false worship. And so the Levirate cities in the northern kingdom, all those different cities where the Levites were supposed to be spread out throughout the tribes of Israel, were dissolved. We do see that in verse 23, Rehoboam, it says he acted wisely, dispersing some of his sons throughout the districts of Judah and Benjamin. And to all the fortified cities, he gave them abundant provisions and took many wives for them. So we see that Rehoboam in some ways acts wisely, but then in chapter 12, verse 1, after Rehoboam's position as king was established and he had become strong, he and all Israel with him abandoned the law of the Lord. And so in other ways, he is far less wise. As we continue on in chapter 12, we see in verse 13 that King Rehoboam established himself firmly in Jerusalem and continued as king. He was 41 years old when he became king, and he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem. The city the Lord had chosen out of all the tribes of Israel in which to put his name. His mother's name was Naamah. She was an Ammonite. So we see that Rehoboam's ancestry influences his relationship with God. So Naamah, being an Ammonite, certainly influenced Rehoboam probably to shift away from a pure worship of the Lord. And I think it's an important lesson for us to be able to see that we ought not to discount the amount of influence that we can have on future generations. Well, we shift over to 1 Kings chapter 15, and there we see that Abijah became king of Judah after Rehoboam, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 3 years. And also Asa becomes king of Judah after Abijah. And so, in both of these situations, and Nadab actually, as the king of Israel near the end of the chapter, Baasha, king of Israel, also near the end of the chapter, we see that as we read through these different kings, the value of the leader is in their ability to point people to God, to point the God's people back to God. And so those that point the people to God are considered righteous, and those that do not do that are considered evil. Flipping back to Second Chronicles chapter 13, this is also talks about Abijah. And here we see that reliance on the Lord in the face of adversity is something to be elevated, something to be held up as a model. And we see that happening when Abijah relies upon the Lord. In Second Chronicles chapter 14, this also, much like the First Kings passage, talks about Asa. And when we are faithful, we can expect God's protection. Asa is faithful to the Lord, and therefore God protects him from the dangers and the other nations that are around him. In Second Chronicles chapter 15, we read about Asa's reform throughout the kingdom. In verse 8, it says, when Asa heard these words and the prophecy of Azariah, son of Oded, the prophet, he took courage. He removed the detestable idols from the whole land of Judah and Benjamin, from the towns he had captured in the hills of Ephraim. He repaired the altar of the Lord that was in front of the portico of the Lord's temple. Well, if the altar needed to be repaired, it meant that the altar was not being used either properly or at all. And so it has fallen into such disrepair that, and probably through lack of use, that it needed to be repaired. And then verse 9, it says, Then he assembled all Judah and Benjamin and the people from Ephraim, Manasseh, and Simeon, who had settled among them, for large numbers had come over to him from Israel when they saw that the Lord his God was with him. And you notice here how other tribes are drawn to Judah because of how God had blessed them. And that becomes a lesson for us as well, that as God blesses us, we can become a means through which people are drawn to the Lord. On verse 10, it says that they assembled at Jerusalem in the third month of the 15th year of Asa's reign. The third month corresponds with the festival of Shavuot, or the festival of weeks, or what we call Pentecost, which celebrated originally in the Jewish festivals the giving of a law. And this is an appropriate time for them to be celebrating this, because it Asa is reestablishing the covenant with God, and so perfect time to be doing that is during a celebration that recognizes the giving of the law. As we move into Second Chronicles chapter 16, we begin to see in Asa's last years his downfall, how he has a reliance on other men, other countries, rather than on God. So in verse 7, we read, At that time, Hanani the seer came to Asa, king of Judah, and said to him, Because you relied on the king of Aram and not on the Lord your God, the army of the king of Aram has escaped from your hand. And then later on in verse 12, it reads, In the 39th year of his reign, Asa was afflicted with a disease in his feet. Though his disease was severe, even in his illness, he did not seek help from the Lord, but only from the physicians. And so Asa, near the end of his reign, really begins to rely more on other people rather than on God. I don't think, just to be clear, that this passage is saying that we ought not to go to physicians. In fact, it emphasizes that he only sought help from physicians. So certainly it's okay for us to go to physicians and seek help, but ultimately we ought to be bringing our needs, both physical and otherwise, before the Lord, for him to work in our lives. As we shift back to 1 Kings chapter 16, we see that there is this continual spiral of idolatry in the northern kingdom. In verse 31, we read that Ahab, who's going to be a primary character for the next few chapters, that he not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and to worship him. So there's this, much like the book of Judges keeps spiraling into worse and worse situations. We see the same thing happening in Israel, where there's this continual spiral into idolatry. And then at the very last part of verse 34, it says, In Ahab's time, Hiel of Bethel rebuilt Jericho. He laid its foundation at the cost of his firstborn son, Abiram, and he set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, in accordance with the word of the Lord spoken by Joshua, son of Nun. So that's a prophecy that Joshua had made in the book of Joshua, chapter 6, verse 26, regarding Jericho. And now all these years later, it is fulfilled through Hiel rebuilding Jericho. As we return to Second Chronicles chapter 17, we see that there is, during Jehoshaphat's reign, a resurgence of the word of God. Verse 9 talks about how the Levites taught throughout Judah, taking with them the book of the law of the Lord, and they went around to all the towns of Judah and taught the people. So this resurgence of the word of God is the basis of the peace and prosperity that is experienced during Jehoshaphat's reign. As we get into 1 Kings chapter 17, we are introduced to Elijah. Elijah has approximately 20 plus year ministry, and it begins here in chapter 17. We can see in verses 1 through 6 that even though the drought is coming, that God provides for his servants by bringing Elijah to a brook and using ravens to bring him food. And then in verse 7, it says that sometime later the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. And instead of providing miraculous water, which clearly God could do, he did that for the Israelites throughout the 40-year wandering in the desert. Instead, God provides a Gentile. Look at verse 8. Then the word of the Lord came to him, go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. And so it is, it's a bit surprising, I guess we would say, that rather than keeping Elijah in the promised land, he has him go to this Sidonian Zarephath widow, which Jesus actually is going to talk about when he's talking about the God's care and love for the Gentiles. And so Elijah meets the widow. She is about to have her last, bake her last loaf of bread, but God miraculously allows the flour and the oil that she has to continue to be, I guess we would say, refreshed every day, even though she's making bread every day for as long as Elijah is there. However, at one point, the widow's son dies, and she goes to Elijah and somewhat complains to him about it. And then Elijah goes in, and it said that in verse 21 that Elijah stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried out to the Lord, Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him. And then the Lord heard Elijah's cry, the boy's life returned. In verse 24, it says, then the woman said to Elijah, now I know that you are a man of God and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. I really think both these incidents are a foreshadowing of the ministry of Jesus, who also multiplied loaves of bread and fish, of course, to be able to feed people. So in some ways similar to the flour and oil multiplication. But of course, we also see that in Jesus for 3 days, he has died and then is resurrected. And it is not so much the miracle of the multiplication of the bread. It is the resurrection of Jesus that really convinces people of who Jesus is. When we get to chapter 18, we have the very well-known fire from heaven story about Elijah. Now, lightning or fire from heaven, I think the people at the time knew the difference between the two, but I think fire from heaven is likely talking about lightning. Lightning was a mark of Baal. So when lightning occurred, Baal worshippers believed that Baal was kind of involved in that. But we know there are no storm clouds during this test that Elijah is going to put the Baal worshippers and the Baal priests through on Mount Carmel. When we get to verse 27, at noon, Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. Surely he's good. Perhaps he's deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened. Certainly, that word busy there could mean that he's doing other, he's on other business. The prophets are not important enough for Baal to respond to, or it could be a euphemism for he's on the toilet, so he's busy and can't come and respond to you. Because Elijah is taunting and mocking the people, I kind of lean towards that second one, but it could mean either there. And then verse 29, it says, midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying till the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. Notice those repeated negatives there. It just really is drilling home that Baal is is worthless. Baal is powerless. Um, and God, by contrast, is all powerful. So in verse 31, it reads Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, your name shall be Israel. Now, this is surprising because, of course, Elijah is ministering to the northern kingdom, which has 10 tribes, and then the southern kingdom has 2 tribes. So the kingdom may be functionally divided, but not in God's mind. In God's mind, his people remain the 12 tribes of Israel. And so it's interesting that God continues to see Israel in that light.